another edition of the Community Solutions Radio Podcast. I am Jason Bradley, as usual, taking the helm here, and as always, well, I guess you're not really to my right this time. You're over on my left.
I'm on your left?
Yeah.
Oh, boy. I've taken a wrong turn somewhere then, if I'm on your left. Maybe I am on your left. I'm not sure.
Today you are. I mean, unless we kind of go counterclockwise, eventually on my right it gets
That's
to
right.
you.
If we're going around in a circle, then.
Yeah. Well, here we are. Last time you heard from us, it was right before the 2016 elections, and here we are after the 2016 elections, and wow. Nobody saw a lot of this coming. Some people did see it coming. We're going to get into some of that. We're going to talk about things for a change kind of at a national level and work our way back to the local level, because it's really important, I think, to understand how it all works together. And sometimes we don't make that correlation that the stuff that does happen at the federal level, well, we kind of downplay it and say the stuff at the local level is important. The stuff that does happen at the federal level does happen. It affects what's at the local level, because when the cash starts to flow in, you'll find that that's where a lot of policy gets made. So, wow. I mean, were you as surprised as I was, Andrew, at the outcome?
Yeah, I was. And I have to admit that I'll say straight out, I did vote for Mr. Trump. And it was a little reluctantly. He wasn't my guy from the beginning. You know, me and you are laser focused locally.
Right.
On a national level, I was surprised. I'm not surprised that he did okay. I didn't think he'd lose by a wide margin. I am surprised, though, at how many people missed what he was doing. If you look at the way Trump campaigned at the end, it was about the economic outsider message. He identified with the people who think we're getting screwed. And often Republican candidates don't do that. They just don't do it enough.
Right.
I didn't think Mr. Romney did that, and I liked him to a point. I mean, he wasn't my guy necessarily either, but I don't think they were able to, and I don't want to compare like Trump to Reagan or anything like that, but I think Trump was able to talk to that blue-collar worker in Ohio and in Michigan and places like that and turn just enough of them. I mean, he really spent those last few days. I think Mrs. Clinton was arrogant. I think she showed, she raised more money and blew more money and thought she'd sleepwalk to this thing. Mm-hmm. I think it is... I think a vote for her was kind of a slap at Washington and at President Obama. Mm-hmm. If you look at President Obama, if he wasn't on the ballot, his party got shellacked every time.
Oh, yes.
I think the party, almost in a Reagan-like way, not comparing Obama to Reagan, okay, I don't want to get emails that I'm doing that, but if Obama was on the ballot, people separated him and his policies a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think if his policies were on the ballot and he wasn't, there was a real problem there. And I think, you look at it almost nationwide. I mean, it happened in nearly every state that was close. The sort of middle-class, blue-collar worker was the one who put Trump over the top. And you look at a state like Ohio, Trump had a higher percentage of the vote in Ohio than he had in Texas. I mean, just as an example of the ferocity. And I think the Democrats played a role in that. I think their environmental wacko part of them. I mean, Hillary Clinton walks into a coal mine in Pennsylvania and basically tells them she's going to put them out of business.
Yes.
Well, can you blame them? I'm sure their union heads and all that are obliged to support her, but I'm telling you that the average person heard that and said, "What the hell?"
Yeah, which surprised me. I mean, looking at the Iron Range, that with the problems that they've had with PolyMet and the other mines up there, getting them going because of the environmental restrictions and the court cases, and that he didn't do better up there. I mean, he did okay, but
I think that may have been Trump's personality versus his politics.
could be.
I think some people who maybe agreed with him maybe voted for neither. I mean,
I don't know though. I mean, you look at what Rick Nolan's done up there, and I don't understand why Stuart Mills didn't do better because he didn't have that kind of personality. Now, rich business people, I mean, they had that in common, but other than that, I mean, there's not a lot of common ground.
yeah, I don't know. And you look at the same thing down in CD1. I mean, here where Waltz nearly lost, and I mean, it was very, very close. And 7 is a matter of time before the Republicans take that over as well. It's and I think that you know here's the problem. I see a lot of good things and bad things. I'm going to say for both parties. And it's strange I say that after one party won by a pretty convincingly.
Right.
And I'm going to back it up a little more nationally. I think the Republicans have a tremendous opportunity that I thought they somewhat blew under President Bush, that to show that their ideas can work, that they can govern. And I think you're going to see a honeymoon for a while.
Yeah.
I think there's some issues, and I'm backing up from the election. We'll get back into the actual results in a second. But if you see what President Trump and the Congress can do, you've got, I don't think there's any question you're going to see tax cuts.
No.
I don't think there's any question you're going to see a conservative Supreme Court nominee. I think Trump gets it. I think he understands. I nominate Andrew Napolitano. I'm just going to say that out straight.
That would be a great choice.
Yeah. And I think Trump's going to get 2 or 3 more. I mean, you look at Anthony Kennedy's 86 years old. Ruth Ginsburg's 83.
Yep.
I mean, if he serves 8 years, he's going to get at least 2 more, maybe 3. I think you're going to see action on Obamacare. I think I think that was a defining issue. That whether people have come to the conclusion it's not working. And they are not going to they're going to give the Republicans a chance to change things. And I think you're going to see harmony on some of that stuff. I think you're going to see action on immigration. And that might be a touchy one, but I think all Republicans of all stripes have come to the conclusion that it can't stay the way it is. And when we get into local stuff with like sanctuary cities, I mean, we'll get into that later, but I don't think you're going to see a wall, but I think you're going to see some measures against employers and against people who maybe would otherwise come here. I don't think anybody's going to be kicked out other than criminals, but I think you are going to see action there. The 2 things I'm interested in seeing, I'm curious to get your take on these.
Yeah.
One is foreign policy, and the other is trade. And I think, my opinion, there's the Republicans who want free trade, who want to open up markets. There's the I don't want to call it protectionist, but there's the I would call it fair trade.
Right.
Whether that's with China, which holds so much of our debt, whether that's with NAFTA. You know, there's been the Pat Buchanan, Duncan Hunter wing of the party that's criticized that. Yeah. NAFTA would, as much as it was President Clinton, but it wouldn't have passed without Republican votes.
Exactly.
President Reagan did shelve it in the 80s, but I personally side with Trump on the issue. I think that blanket free trade is a net negative, but it's going to be interesting to see how that gets maneuvered, how you can redo a trade deal or just come in and say how does that work? He actually may have more Democratic support for that than maybe he even realizes. Then the other issue to me is foreign policy. I mean, Trump has been kind of a hawk on ISIS and things like that. He's been critical of nation building. So where does he steer there? If you're going to go after ISIS, you're talking special forces, you're talking special ops.
Yep.
You're still talking about going somewhere and taking somebody out. I mean, it's, you're still talking, and then I think if there's another issue, real quick, and before I get to let you talk, is the issue of reducing the size of government. And,
Right.
and is Trump a federalist conservative? He didn't campaign as a small government guy, and I'm a little concerned about that he may be out of step with the Congress or with the activists on just generally speaking, forget where, but reducing the size of government. So I see some harmony. I see some things getting done in the next 6 months. Then the real test, I think, for the president and for Congress and for Republican governors and everywhere else is what to do about trade. There's states that depend on exports. There's states that depend on imports. How do you match that up with Trump's blue collar message and all that? And I'm curious to see what you think of my analysis there, or what do you think differently?
Right. Our founders had a principle that they adhered to where, feel free to engage with all nations, just don't get entangled in any of them.
George Washington's farewell address,
Yes.
I think, is what you're referencing.
Yes, exactly.
It's a great, you know what? Look it up.
Yeah.
It's a great insight. It's like Washington could see 200 years in the future. Seriously.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing read. But and this is where, if Donald Trump truly is a free trade / non-entanglement, non-nation building guy, he kind of lines up with Washington's vision of how to run government from that level. And that was the whole idea, that we could trade with anybody that we wanted to, that, we didn't get into these entanglements that where we could kind of get blackmailed into doing what they want us to do. They didn't hold debt over our heads. We didn't go in and put up puppet governments that later came around to bite us because they treated their people horribly, and then the people that we would replace them with after we removed them were even worse.
Oh, not talking about Iran, are we?
Oh, that's one of
That's a good
more than
example,
one,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Egypt.
Right.
Well,
Right, Chile.
Yeah, and I mean, and if
Yeah.
you take that kind of even a step further, I mean, the more, and this is kind of the how you go about this is, it's easy to say get tough with China. I mean,
Right.
love to see it, but there's two other lines of thinking. One, China is still a communist government. Their economy is not a command economy the way, say, the old Eastern Bloc of the Warsaw Pact and all that.
Right.
It has changed. And one way to get rid of communism is to introduce capitalism. It's one of the arguments I've heard for trading with Cuba.
Right.
That if you introduce capitalism, people are going to choose that. And they're not going to want to go back to a command economy. I think the problem that I've had with free trade is it's only free if you're trading with equals.
Right.
You look at something like NAFTA, and I've been a big critic of NAFTA. If you remove barriers, first off, if you don't have a border, you don't have a country. I mean, that's one thing just to think about right there. Second, you're incentivize somebody. If I can produce something in Mexico and pay somebody $4 an hour and then send my product to the United States with no additional cost, I've sent that job to Mexico. Eventually, that job is going to leave. Now, some jobs are gone and they're not coming back.
All right. Well, let me ask you this then. So we don't want to trade with people necessarily that aren't our equals because we come out on the short end of the stick, or we have companies that have moved overseas and they want to come back and do business here because it's cheaper for them to do it that way. I'm a little concerned about the use of tariffs, and I don't know what you think of this because the whole Smoot-Hawley tariff is what brought us into the Great Depression, and I don't want to see that happen because we have decided that we're going to, in effect, punish people to level the playing field.
Yeah, Smoot-Hawley was not talk about bad timing of putting something into back in 1930, and let's call a tariff what it is. I mean, it's a sales tax. We call it something different, but really what it is it's just another tax, another regressive tax put on products not made in this country. That's what the definition of a tariff is. I don't want to see tariffs. I don't want to force people to pay more for the same things. I think the way to go about this is to negotiate fair trade, not necessarily free trade, and at the same time couple it with legislation that reduces the burden on employers, whether that's not raising the minimum wage, which could be one, which ultimately I think hurts jobs, not helps. It helps out the government unions. That's about the only people it helps out. I would also like to see a reduction in both personal and corporate taxes, as well as regulations. I mean, if you look at, I've said this before, we have a higher corporate tax rate than the former Soviet Union.
Wow.
What does that say about the supposed freest country in the world? And the regulations, the requirements, the unemployment tax and matching FICA and all the things that a company, just to hire one person, healthcare choices, states like Minnesota where you can't purchase health insurance unless it's a Minnesota nonprofit. I mean, that really lowers your freedom of choice. Those things have to be coupled with fairer trade deals. So, again, I think it's not one aspect of it. I think you can cut a bad deal. And I think you get in situations like the federal government's in with China where they own our debt.
Yeah.
They own, they're the bondholders of our treasury notes. So we've made bad policy, and that has... I don't want to say held us hostage to them, but like I said earlier, it's easy to say get tough with them. But
right.
It's harder when they can call in the bonds or whatever, and what are we going to do?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like you have a bunch of countries now that want to replace the dollar as the world standard, and they have the ability to hold that over our head because we rely so heavily. It's like, I've heard people refer to it as economic mutually assured destruction. And I don't think that that's a place we want to or should put ourselves as a country.
And I'll tell you, the European Union has created a lot of those problems too. You've got 20 different countries trying to use one currency.
Right.
I mean, talk about devaluing. I mean, anything can happen that affects all of them. It's a total net negative. Same things happen in Greece. I mean, if your scenario plays out, we'll all buy Greek bonds, and I guess we'll all go down together. I mean, it's an entangled mess. It's not impossible to be walked back at this point, but I think it starts with no more going forward. That we've got to. I think if President Trump and the Congress, and again, I don't know that they can come together on this because I think Trump's a little out of step with the party. And I think more Democrats may sign for different reasons, because to me the Democrats won't do anything about the regulations, the taxes, anything like that, and then they complain about the trade deals. It's you got to look at why companies are moving and fix that end of it. And I think that's where Trump and the Congress really need to focus rather than pinpointing one particular deal. You could put a moratorium on right now. We're going to fix Obamacare first. We're going to cut taxes first.
Yeah.
And then cut a deal after that. Cut a deal from strength. Reduce the deficit, which would be another good idea. But our trade debt is over $1 billion a month. That is coming in versus what we're sending out. So that can't continue forever. We can't continue. America can't consume everything. And if our exports continue to decline, look at it like this. We don't even manufacture our own defense weapons anymore.
Right.
Some of that's contracted out. I mean, how can you be an independent nation when the weapons you use to defend yourself, you're dependent on somebody else to make?
Exactly.
So, and the oil and stuff we use to gas them up, and which we're dependent a lot on foreign nations, even though we have plenty of oil here. I mean, it's a real problem. And for some who think the trade deficit's not a problem, I scratch my head at it. And we can't be a service only country and make and produce nothing. It's impossible for us to exist as a nation like that. So I think that again, it's a two-part thing. You've got to fix the bad healthcare laws, couple that with less government, and I think you can negotiate from a position of strength then. These companies aren't going to want to leave. They're going to want to employ Americans who are educated and all that and good at what they do. But, if you give a carte blanche to somebody to say, okay, you can go from paying somebody $25 to $5, eventually labor is going to find the lowest common denominator. It's kind of like everything else in the economy. Eventually, supply and demand finds that equilibrium. So I think Trump is right that we have been sold out to a certain extent by companies who know no borders and no rules and go where there aren't rules. And
Right. Well, I mean, given the punitive actions of the federal government over the past number of decades, though, if that was an option, wouldn't you do it? I don't know. I mean, it's not always the most ethical thing. And that's really the question, is a matter of ethics. And I want to employ American workers, but the costs are so high that I can't afford to. Where do you draw that line in the sand? And every company has to draw that line a little differently.
And where does our government draw the line? Is it our job to chase businesses out that we don't like?
Exactly.
I mean, you look at something like the green energy is a good example of where the government is trying to force something to happen instead of letting the marketplace do its job. We've gone from coal to oil in this country, and it wasn't because of government policy. It was because of private sector innovation. Mm-hmm. And the same thing, and I've said this before, GE, General Electric, is the biggest recipient of government subsidies. They're out there. That entire company is subsidized by you and me as taxpayers. Walmart is getting subsidized. Again, the same people the Democrats rail against, they're getting subsidized for putting up solar panels on their stores.
Right.
We're paying for it. A subsidy is just a transfer of payment from an individual to a government. So we're trying to force one industry to happen rather than letting the marketplace do its job. And that goes back to the deregulation argument, to the taxes argument, cap and trade, which is another thing that certainly would have cost us jobs. But we all know that the President Obama and the EPA are trying to implement, and in some cases did implement that, even though Congress never approved it.
Right. And that's a great point. I mean, we see all this money that trickles out. Well, it doesn't trickle out. It's more like the Hoover Dam broke in half, and and it does do a couple of things. One is they tell us, this is how you have to do things, and the other is you're not allowed to do these certain things. And we've seen a huge impact on things like the oil industry, the coal industry, the automotive industry, and I think that has really taken a negative effect on the economic landscape of our country.
There's no doubt about it. And I want to say, too, that, I don't want dirty water. I don't want dirty air. We're not arguing that. It is the unnecessary burden being put on American businesses that is not put in another country. You go off, the biggest polluters in the world are China and India. It's strangely, the environmentalists aren't over there protesting. If you care about the environment, they should be there complaining about these companies that have left the places that have strict regulations. And remember, all that adds to the cost of their end product, which is something that people on the left, I swear, just cannot understand economics 101. If you raise the cost to make a product, you've raised the cost to consume a product.
Right.
I mean, companies have a fiduciary responsibility to make money for their shareholders, many of which are their employees. And the more you put on that, the more you hurt their ability to do that. And I really think, again, it's a chance for the president and for Congress to forge that coalition of business and labor, who can be strange bedfellows. But if you keep those good-paying jobs here and you cut the taxes and regulation for the companies, then I think it's a win-win all the way around. I've got some reservations about how that's done sometimes.
Right.
I'm really not in favor of tax cuts for a certain industry or reducing taxes for companies who have their headquarters in the United States has been talked about, which may sound like a great idea, but the truth is the better policy is to not play favorites with the tax code. It's to reduce taxes for everybody and let the market dictate the supply and demand and the pricing end of it.
Well, and that's a lot of, the back and forth on this.
And, just to jump to another issue, you mentioned foreign policy and George Washington's farewell address.
Yes, I did.
Things like that. I think one thing about foreign policy that we should mention is how it's concentrated now in the executive branch. The president will be making foreign policy.
Right.
Not Congress. Congress has ceded a lot of their authority, and it's not for the better, I don't think.
Right. I don't think it is either. They basically, in most cases, have retained their ability to make war or not. And they can defund things, but I mean, on a general wide scale, I mean, they really don't have a lot they can do.
No, and you look at defunding isn't as simple as we make it sound. Are you going to not pay the soldiers? Are you going to take their guns away? Are you going to take away the helicopters that bring them to safety? I mean, defunding a military operation isn't very simple. And we've seen with President Trump how he doesn't want a nation build, but he wants to go after the terrorists, the ISIS groups. He's going to have to go to other countries to do that. And at the same time, if you look at history, with presidents have had their way in foreign policy. We've put troops in I don't know how many countries. The last time we declared war was 1941. And how many troops have been put or died somewhere, whether it's we think we have a moral duty to do something or whether or not there's a security threat to the United States, which is, I would argue, defined differently by different people.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's you go to Truman in Korea, and Eisenhower put troops in Lebanon, and Reagan in Grenada, and Bill Clinton in Somalia. I mean, Obama in Libya. You can come up with a million examples of troops going somewhere and getting tossed in the middle of something unilaterally by the president.
Right.
And sometimes there's the argument of a moral obligation to do something, but aren't we at a time where being the world's policeman is very unappetizing to me?
And me as well. I believe also sometimes there's a moral obligation when, like in the Sudan or in Rwanda, the killing fields of Cambodia, people are the targets of genocide. We look back, even as far back as probably one of my favorite presidents, Thomas Jefferson. And because of threats to American security and American interests, he went after the Barbary pirates. Now, Jefferson, we would say in some respects, is the author of how we view liberty in the United States because of the Declaration of Independence. Now, and many of his other writings after that. But he still decided that he had to go after the Barbary pirates because we couldn't do business. Our commerce was threatened. The safety of our sailors was threatened. And so I think that there are times when we do have to step into that role. But I think when we stay and we put in a Pinochet, when we put in a Shah of Iran, when we put in a Saddam Hussein, when we put in, any of these leaders and we prop them up, we get into trouble.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at something like the first Gulf War. Look at the war in 1991.
Right.
Where you could argue a humanitarian effort, that a country was being invaded by certainly one of the worst dictators we've ever seen. And we ended up in Saudi Arabia and kicked him out of Kuwait. And guess what? We, to this day, have never left.
Right.
We're still in Saudi Arabia.
Uh-huh.
We're still in Korea. Korea is still defined as a war zone. The 38th parallel, I think it is still to this day. There's been a ceasefire since 1953, and it's still considered a war zone. We never leave these places. And so I think there is a humanitarian argument. There's an argument that we should go after ISIS, but chasing ISIS in Syria and getting rid of Assad and propping up somebody else is, to me, out of bounds with the president's constitutional authority.
Right.
And so it's going to be hard to walk that back, though, with the precedents that have been set. I hope that we don't get entangled in anything, and I hope Mr. Trump keeps his word. But, a lot of times when we've toppled a government, but a worse government, you create a vacuum for somebody else to come in and make something a whole lot worse.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we propped up Chiang Kai-shek in China, and who was a corrupt dictator, and got kicked out to Taiwan. And what happened? The country went to communist, and has been that way ever since. So, it and some of these countries, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? I mean, it's.
Yeah, I mean, Syria, you pit ISIS against Assad. Neither one is a good guy, but how do you untangle that mess? We're in way over our heads.
Well, I've said before, a revolution starts from within. I mean, we faced the same challenge in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union did the same thing in Afghanistan when they invaded in 1979. You're taking a tribal community, however wrong we think that is, and you're trying to implement a democracy there. And even though that sounds good and it sounds noble, and I understand it, there's a lot of growing pains that happen during a stretch like that.
Oh, absolutely.
But, broader to the point, I mean, I think with the election and the opportunity that we have here, the biggest thing that I hope we see is a return from federal government doing everything and dictating to states and cities, municipalities, counties, school districts. There's an opportunity to transfer that back to the original intent, to be a union of states again, which we certainly are not. And how to bring that about, and if it can come about.
Right. Well, and I know in an earlier discussion we were talking about the 9th and 10th Amendments and how people don't really understand them. And they hear about states' rights maybe, but I don't think they really get it. And just for the sake of the argument, I'll go through it. 9th Amendment basically says that your liberty ends where the liberty of another begins. Now, in the case of, say, the federal government, when you are doing something and all of a sudden the property of the state government or the laws of the state government begin at that point, that's where the federal government's power ends. Now, where is that line? The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, rather, the 10th Amendment says it is where the Constitution ends. It's a negative set of liberties. The federal government can do only this much and no more. Everything else has to be ceded to the states.
Yes, absolutely. And we always remember that the Constitution is a document against government. It does not give us our rights. Our rights come from our Creator. It is telling you what government cannot do to you. Government cannot infringe your freedom of speech. The Black Panthers and the KKK have just as much a right to their freedom of speech as anybody. We don't have to listen to them. We can condemn what they say, but they have every right to exist. Our right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Sounds simple. We've certainly changed the quote-unquote interpretation of that. And if I've got an issue with both parties, they both think that the Constitution's a Whitman sampler, that it's a lunch buffet. They can pick and choose which amendments they like and which ones they don't. Republicans will defend the Second Amendment until their head explodes. Where are they on the other 26?
Right.
The Democrats will defend the Voting Rights Amendment to the extreme, to the blinding themselves of voter fraud. Yet where are they on the other amendments? Where are they on the second? Where are they on the 9th and 10th? I mean, I wonder if your average Democrat in Congress could tell you what the 9th and 10ths are. So, if we all were united in protecting constitutional principles, our debates would be very, very minor, I think. And the role of government would be what it's supposed to be.
Right. But, I mean, we've seen this downgraded. States' rights have not been what they should be since the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, really, with Teddy Roosevelt in taking over state land for national parks. I mean, this is property that belongs to the state, and they control 90-some% of Nevada. The feds do.
I know the federal government controls 28% of all land in the U.S.
Yeah, which is astronomical, and it's ridiculous. So we have all these national parks, all these, military bases I can make an argument for. I mean, we need a place to put those. I understand that. And maybe that, I don't know what the arrangement should be. Is it leased out? Is it federal land? Is it state land that the military just uses? Whatever, but where we take these big swaths of land and natural resources and say this is off limits.
Well, and the big problem with Mr. Roosevelt was doing it without an act of Congress, because you're not setting up standards or things like that for a land to be declared. One could argue that the Badlands should be preserved and are a great thing for South Dakota, a great tourist thing. Don't want to build houses on it. Okay, I can buy that, but that shouldn't be at the whim of one person. It shouldn't be that a president can use an endangered minnow to come in and cordon off land to where nobody can use.
Right.
One could argue Yellowstone is a great national park. I've been there. I'm going back there this summer. Yeah, I agree. But the process to which something like that is made into a park or made into a national monument or whatever you want to call it, historic preserve, and you see it on the local level too. Ridiculous things are trying to be preserved as some sort of a defunct business is trying to be reserved as some sort of national treasure or something like that. I would take your argument further that 1913 was the year that we really lost, the year of, because President Taft slowed down a lot of the, he didn't use his executive power the way Roosevelt did and was much more conservative. But by 1913, when you had the populists, the William Jennings Bryan wing of the Democratic Party took over the country, what did you see? You saw the Federal Reserve, you saw the income tax, you saw the direct election of U.S. senators, which divorced states from the federal government. The way the federal government was set up was that you'd have direct representation, indirect representation, and states being represented.
Right.
And we do not have that anymore.
No, we do not.
So, but let's get back to how it affects us. How does a national election affect us here?
And that's a great question because we see, all the stuff that happens nationally in the paper and on TV. We see a good chunk of what happens at the state level on TV in our newspapers, but we don't often see the interconnectedness of that, and we certainly don't see how that affects us at a local level and how a lot of the money and regulations that are offered and made there trickle their way down, or rather are shoved down our throats to affect everyday life for us.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at all these federal departments, from energy to the Environmental Protection Agency, from the Housing and Urban Development, from the FTA, from the ATF, from Department of Education. They all have sort of their tentacles in our state government, in our county government, in our local government. Many big projects have some sort of federal standards, federal money, federal rules, federal regulations. Some knucklehead in Washington trying to take credit for bringing other people's tax dollars to your district when that's not the oath they took. So it does get entangled. I think education may be the big, and I'm pretty encouraged by Mr. Trump's education secretary. She's somebody who favors freedom in education, and I think it's probably why the Democrats are going after her so much. But if you think about it, if we free the states and the school districts to make their own choices, and free them of all these tests and all these things that make Washington look good, what they could do, what you'd free the teachers and the students to go as in any direction that they want to, instead of the one-size-fits-all rules that come down from the federal government.
Right, and we see that in education. We see it also in transportation, where, and let's just play this out here in the cities. The Metro Council is trying to put in light rail. Now, I know some of the lines are a little more, some are a little less, but we'll just say, for ease of math, it's $1 billion for a light rail line. And let's say they want to put 13 lines around the cities. Well, that's $13 billion. And let's say that we're on the hook then for half of that. And they're on the hook for half of that. So you've got $6.5 billion that the federal government is chipping in just here in Minneapolis. Just in Minneapolis for light rail. And you talk about we've talked about for a long time how all these cities are trying to do the same thing because it's what's talked about by the planners associations and everything else. League of Minnesota Cities, other states have the same kinds of things. So we then are asking $6.5 billion from the federal government. Well, if we look at this, is happening in 50 states. Some states only have one city where you might put light rail. Some have 3, 4, 5. I mean, huge state like California, you've got San Diego.
And all their suburbs.
Yeah, all the suburbs. You've got San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland. You've got number of cities. Even a smaller state like Ohio, you've got Cincinnati and Cleveland, maybe even like Dayton. So you can imagine how that adds up over time. And I know you and I have both explained it, that all this money comes in from all over the country, and we take, say, all these tax dollars from Virginia, Delaware, and Idaho, and instead of going to the people that are paying them, they go to the state of Wisconsin. And
Well, first they go to
first they go to
bureaucrats in
Washington. They take their cut.
Then it goes through sometimes it goes to the state government, which then takes a cut and
Right.
goes lower. That happens a lot with education, Title I money, things like that. It pretty much happens, and they all have their requirements. Federal government comes in and says, well, you got to put blankety blank forms of housing around this.
Right.
You've got to put sidewalks around this. You've got to put. It's why all these projects look the same. They all use the same language, have the same things associated with them, because it's all coming from one place. And I think that walking this back is where our lawmakers have really failed, because they've enabled the agencies to do these jobs rather than do the jobs themselves. You mentioned the Met Council. The lawmakers don't want to be held accountable for these decisions.
Right.
So they create legislation that passes the decision-making to somebody else. MnDOT, the DNR, they're making regulations. Go get a fishing license.
Yes.
Who's making all of these rules of where you can and can't fish and can't keep a fish and can't keep a fish this big and can only catch 3 fish in June or whatever? I mean, I don't know what it is. It's who is overseeing this. And that's the monster that's been created. But your state monster has a federal monster above that. There's the state has a Department of Education, which of course is somewhat constitutionally mandated here in Minnesota. We do have a provision in our Constitution that provides for the system of schools. It doesn't say it has to look the way it does, but that is there. And how do we walk that back? I mean, where does it start? I mean, we have to stop the bleeding first.
Right.
And then it's got to be walked back. But who has to stop the bleeding?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think the federal government anytime soon is going to stop offering money to make things look the way that they want. And if they do, that's great. If President Trump says, you know what, we're going to give states their rights back, and we're not going to offer free money and tell people how to do things, and we're just going to cut taxes wildly, that's one way that can happen, and that's awesome. But I think it's going to come more from the local level, people in city councils, school boards, county commissions saying, no, we're not going to do this, and we're just keep your free money. We're not interested. We'll figure out how we're going to do this on our own, and you can just keep it.
Well, it probably has to be a two-pronged thing. It's like the way to get rid of the Met Council here in Minnesota.
Yeah.
You're going to have a hostile legislature, and you're going to have some hostile local governments.
Right.
I'm not sure the legislature could do it. I think it would take an act of Congress to get these departments in line. But again, it's where your lawmakers have fallen short. It's where they've punted responsibility to a bunch of lifetime employees that you and I can't touch.
Right.
So, there's nothing to stop. And the same thing, to a certain extent, does happen in cities. I mean, how many cities have a council where the city staff has made the rules, and that's the way they've done it for 20 years, and it ain't changing.
No, it's not going to change unless one side begins to move.
Somebody has to take the initiative. And so getting back to what I think will happen, I think you're going to see some movement in this. One of the other things I think we're for sure going to see is healthcare reform. I think that the Republicans at a federal level have been given a mandate to reform the Affordable Care Act.
I think so.
Whether they repeal it completely, repeal 2/3 of it, whatever. But I think what's not seen in these things are the burden it is put on local government. Minnesota in 2013, just to explain Obamacare a little bit, it required states to set up what's called an exchange. This is where it becomes a path to senior single payer.
Yes.
Which is where we know the left wants to take it. And they, by 2013, Minnesota set up what's called MNsure, which is our state version of an exchange. And actually, the Democrats stopped an amendment to this that Republicans were pushing that required more than one provider. Technically, we only have to have one provider in MNsure, which, again, is a path to single payer. However, the counties in Minnesota are mandated to carry this out.
Right.
So Hennepin County or Ramsey County or Itasca County or Aiken County or wherever the hell you live is the one doing all of the dirty work. The state government passes a law and then they dump the work onto somebody else. So your local government here is being burdened by what your state government is doing in St. Paul.
Yeah, it happens more than just with that one agency, and it whether we see that in the way that railroads are handled, or whether we see that in the way, like I think we mentioned earlier, like streets are constructed,
welfare, food stamps.
Mm-hmm.
Any other services like that? The federal government set Medicare and Medicaid, and then Minnesota Care.
Mm-hmm.
You've set up all these things. SCHIP. You've set up all these things that are administered at a local level that the federal government has all put in these programs, all aimed at the same demographic. So, again, the dirty work is done by the local government. And then they have to deal with everything else. They've got to deal with the court system. Federal government passes 1 million laws. It's the local district courts that deal with a lot of it.
Right.
State jails, county jails.
Mm-hmm.
So it is. It's been happening for well over 100 years now, and the first step. I think this might be, as Winston Churchill once said, the end of the beginning. Maybe we're at. So many people are fed up, and finally, that you might see some movement on this. But let me ask you, Jay. I mean, what do you see as like the first? If you're an individual just listening to this, I mean, what would you do to stem the tide right in front of your face? Would it start locally? Would it start at the federal government? Would it be both? Would it be to grab a megaphone and scream as loud as you can? I mean, if somebody's saying to us, yes, I agree with you.
Yes.
What do we do now?
That's a great question.
Well, of course, I asked.
Well, of course. Most people would think, I gotta make sure I get out and vote for my guy next time. I gotta put up more lawn signs in my yard. I've gotta listen to more talk radio.
Go to a Tea Party meeting.
And all those things are great. But here's what it comes down to at the end of the day, that we've got to be willing to put our money where our mouth is locally. That's where we begin to stem the tide and turn things back to the way that they should be. This is not just about who we vote for president, who we vote for governor. It's understanding the issues locally and being able to be part of the solution to put the right things in place. So whether that's running for city council, or whether that's being a part of the planning commission or the Parks and Recs board, or whether that's being part of a campaign, or whether that's forming a local watchdog group that looks at city council meetings, work sessions, and reports on this stuff so that there's a trackable record of what goes on in your city. Those are all tangible steps that we can make in order to start turning the tide, because that's what we did here.
Well, and remember something, too, and I've said this, and some people get mad at me when I say it. running for office isn't always your role.
No.
Nobody runs for office by themselves. They have people who help them. They have people who strategize with them. They have people who are activists who do things outside of a campaign. And instead of sitting around waiting for somebody to do something, President Kennedy once said, "Ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Think about words like that. How many hours on Sunday do you spend watching football, and how many hours do you spend studying what's going on 2 blocks from your house?
Yeah, and that's not to say you can't have the game on while you're looking through that stuff.
Even if New England's on. Yeah.
Well, you might as well not even watch at that point.
Yeah,
But New England, Green Bay, don't bother.
I hate them all.
Let me save you the trouble. Just go to your city's website and start reading stuff. That's more enjoyable than watching New England or Green Bay. So.
Yeah. And the other thing too is not everybody in office knows everything. I think one of the mistakes we make is we think these politicians are so smart and they and I don't mean to. Some of them are they're not all bad people. I don't want to put it like that, but many of them are just cogs in the wheel, and they're getting pressured by this group and that group and their majority leader and their committee chair and their party and things like that. But ultimately, we're the people who put them there, and you have to remember that, and you have to. Everybody today has email and phone numbers and Facebook and Twittering, and if you don't participate, if nobody hears from you, that's why we have the government we do.
Exactly. It takes involved people to make a difference, and that's what we have always advocated for. And I think that's where we're really able to help. I know that you got to understand your city before you can start making a change. And sometimes that's a daunting task because there are so many different documents you have to read. It took us a long time to understand a lot of those documents, but it's where a group like us can come in and help support you and teach you how to read a comprehensive plan, how to read a comprehensive annual financial report, how to understand how a work session works. All of these kinds of things, once you understand them, help you to have a great understanding then of the way your communities run, and then you're able to see things as they come down the pike, and you're able to head them off a little better. So by bringing a group like us in to be able to do that, and anything from that to helping to run an election, it only helps you.
Well, and you can go for little change, you can go for big change.
Right.
There's you can always get a small victory, but I think one thing that happens, and I've noticed too, is people get together, they do something great in their community, and there's no follow-up.
Right.
There's no government's not taking a day off, even Sunday. Police are still out writing parking tickets and going after regular citizens instead of criminals. There's always something to do, and I just want to instill in people that we cannot stand by and let our liberty go away. It will be taken from us eventually. All great empires fall from within, and I believe that our nation is dying. I mean, the nation that freedom is, our great grandparents knew it. Is gone. And we have kind of a neo-freedom now with political correctness and with our education system pushing an ideology. We're not free to think. We're not free to express ourselves. We're too beholden to the two-party system. It's the further I believe we're drifting toward world government. I mean, that's just my view, just partly why I don't like free trade. So, you know, it's a scary time, even though I'm hopeful. It still is. We're in uncharted waters here for this country, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. I don't think that we really understand what freedom and liberty are, and rather being free to do things, we see ourselves as being free from certain things.
Yeah, and you think about it like this: how many things do you do where you need the government's permission to do them?
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's open a business, whether that's drive a car, whether that's build something in your backyard.
Yeah.
And again, there could be a certain amount of rules, or I mean, I get that, but freedom as we knew it 100 years ago is nothing close to what it is today. The United States used to be kind of we were the beacon to everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, we were. I had ancestors who came from Europe and so on and so forth to come here for religious freedom or whatever you might say. And we've turned around and become what people were trying to get away from.
Yeah.
So Europe fell from within as well. The kings and queens all fell from within and were replaced. So, who's to say that can't happen here? I mean, it's sad when you see our founding. When I read our founding documents and you see how the founders warned against certain things, and you see us doing them now. It's they were pretty smart guys. You see think we once went to war over a tax on stamps. I mean, and
Yeah.
compare that to the burden we face now, the burden all of us face, whether that's income tax or excess taxes or property taxes or whatever. We have a tremendous burden on us.
Yes, we do. And so, I've always kind of said that I think that the highest taxes should be at the local level, because it's what we deal with every day with our streets, our sewers, our street lights, all of that stuff. And that the least taxes should be at the federal level. Everybody chipping in to have a well-funded army. I mean, you don't need a whole bunch else. But we're sinking so much money into personnel, benefits, into buildings, into vehicles, it's just crazy, not to mention barely servicing our debt. Any of that, the vast government programs we're paying for. And so it gets to a point, I think, where everything is on its head. What should cost the least cost the most, and what should cost the most costs the least. And when I say it should cost the most, I don't mean like it should approach levels like we're paying to the federal government. I think that it should be less. It should be controlled. It should be maintained. It should be minimized to what's necessary, or what people in a given location want to pay for. If they want to pay to maintain a park, if they want to pay for a pool or an amphitheater, great. Go live in that community. Be a part of that. Pay for it. Fantastic. But when we have the choice removed from us because it's in Washington, D.C., or it's in St. Paul versus just down the road, that's where we get onto the slippery slope and taxes run away.
So what's going to happen? I mean, what do you think over the next 2 to 4 years? I mean, do you think are we going to see a repeat of, President Bush, who went in front of the National Governors Association and said he's going to let you control your own affairs, while at the same time passing No Child Left Behind and Medicaid Part D and things like that? Or are we going to see a real because I'm of a double-edged sword on it.
Yeah.
I think Mr. Trump gets business. I think he understands that. I also think he's an egomaniac, and he's going to have a lot of power. And even though I believe him when he says he's going to reverse some executive orders and things like that, I wouldn't characterize him as a small government conservative. So
No.
what direction is, and Congress too? I mean, they have to stop pretending they don't have a role here. Whatever Trump wants, most of it he's got to get them to get to him.
Right.
What do you see happening in the next 2 years? Do you see? Are we going to see tax cuts and some half-hearted efforts to reform Obamacare, or are we going to see a real transfer from Washington on down? What are we going to see with these departments?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've got some interesting things. You've got Rick Perry, a guy who wanted to get rid of the energy department, now in charge of it. What's he going to do with it?
I guess we'll see.
I mean, is he going to, now that I'm in charge, it's okay to have this?
Right.
Or is he going to say, hey, look, we're going to start reducing this. And it's not going to happen in a week, but we're slowly going to walk this back. What do you think will happen?
It's a great question, and that's kind of the big unknown. Everybody seems to be really excited about the prospect of having people in charge of departments that they're kind of against, if not outright against, at least against the current policy and direction of. So we'll see. I mean, hopefully, like you mentioned education earlier, if we see things turned over to, vouchers and charter schools and all of that, that's obviously a step in the right direction. But if the federal government is mandating it, is it really?
No, but I don't see the federal government's role as implementing vouchers, but they can create the environment in which vouchers could flourish.
Right.
One of the things I remember the race to the top.
Oh boy.
President Obama. One of the things that was how they implemented Common Core, because you had to adopt those standards without knowing race to the top. You had to adopt their things. And that was from that Chicago guy that was Obama's education secretary. His name escapes me right now, but who's just a Chicago buddy of the president. But you have to, vouchers are something that need to be implemented locally, but the federal government can assist in creating the environment where that can happen. And I think Rick Perry is a great appointment to the Energy Department. Sometimes a critic is the best person to put in charge. Trump's nominee for the EPA is a climate change skeptic.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. I think it's wonderful. You implement somebody who's a thinker, not an activist. And I think that can only be a positive. I don't know what it will result in tangibly. You're right, that remains to be seen. But I am excited for the overall change in direction. I think Ben Carson is a good person to put in charge. You know how much I hate the housing department.
Yeah.
But he seems to be not too impressed with it either. And, I think maybe that's the right guy to put in charge and say, okay, maybe he'll figure out what's going wrong and what's going right, if there is anything, and right that ship a little bit rather than just putting a political appointee there, or Trump putting one of his buddies there, or putting somebody that tried to win over the Democrats, which is not going to happen for the most part.
Right.
You could put a Colin Powell type in these jobs who is just going to stand there and give, flaky interviews and not really be an agent of change. And I'm of two minds on it. I'm hopeful, but my government's lied to me and let me down so many times. It's hard to get too excited.
So as we wrap up, kind of like final thoughts here, how do we see this working? How do we go about moving from a place of, okay, all this power is amassed in Washington. They tell us what to do. We just take it and do it. We take the free money. How do we divorce ourselves from that? How do we take the power back? How do we start to move in a direction where we assert our independence and change things locally?
Well, again, it's going to be a two-pronged thing. You're going to need people locally to do that, but you're going to need people nationally to do that. I think you can get to a certain point. Like, you could fight the Met Council to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's an act of law that is going to change their power and what they do or think they can do. I mean, ultimately, they're going to have to be reined in by the people who are supposed to be looking over them, which
Right.
is our lawmakers in St. Paul. You can refuse federal money, and that's great. However, if your county accepts it and implements something in your city, you're stopping it as much as you can to a point. Mm-hmm. So I think you need the low end and the high end. I think it starts at the low end, and it can get pushed upward. But ultimately, I think these agencies, and we mentioned them all here in Minnesota, that are out of control, are not going to be reined in. I mean, look what's happening at Mille Lacs Lake right now. The DNRs come in and they've destroyed it up there. They've destroyed the entire industry. They've handicapped all of the small businesses that depend on fishermen and tourists and casino goers and things like that. And we have a governor who just stands there and does nothing. We have a legislature has not. Why aren't they passing regulations against the DNR? Saying, no, leave them the hell alone. Who are you to come in and tell them they can't keep a fish or something like that? I mean, we have to have some guts, and we certainly need a new governor without a doubt. But, as we've seen with these agencies, they work right around whoever the governor is.
Right.
And they're there. They'll be there for the next governor and the governor after that and the governor after that. So if they're not reined in by an act of law, or they're not kicked out or attempted to be kicked out by the locals, you're not going to see a change.
Right. And that's where we've talked about a farm team being so important, where people get into local government, and from there you take your rock stars and you push them up to county government, and you push them up to state government, and eventually up to federal government. People who embrace these changes that you want to make. And we can keep putting in the same old crusty people that make the same old crusty votes, that don't change anything, that don't stand for anything, that don't try to rock the boat, and we wonder why things aren't different. Or we can take it to a new level, and we can attempt to put in new people that will actually do something. When you see them doing something at the local level, you take the best of them and you bring them up to the next level.
Well, and unfortunately, these things can be slow moving. They can
Right.
move at a snail's pace, and government has been growing since 1776, and it's not going to be simple to unwind. But again, it's the people who sit by and say what happened that ultimately cause the rest of us to lose our liberty. I think we've shown here in Crystal that it can be turned around. My vision and hope is that can be turned around everywhere, and I think it can be. But I think it takes the people who live there to do it. It takes the people who live and work and go to school in those areas to do those types of things. So that's, I guess, what I'm thinking is that ultimately, and like I've said before, people walk around and they look, well, we need to find somebody to do this. Well, what's wrong with you?
Right.
What's wrong with you?
And like we've said, maybe you're not meant to run. Well, do some research, join a commission, do something.
Do some podcasts.
Do some podcasts.
Do a podcast. Not that
if
hard.
we can do it,
well, I guess so.
More or less. All right. Well, we've probably babbled on long enough, but
it's never long enough.
No, it seems to fly by. I think it's been a really good discussion, and I think that the more we begin to realize that we do have a hand to play, and that what we do locally has a lot more power than we think it does. Even at national levels, if enough cities were to say that they're not taking the free money, I don't think they'd stop collecting it, unfortunately, but they'll maybe pay down the debt or something until we get people in there that will actually cut taxes.
Yeah, well, a lot of people say no, they might rethink something.
Yeah.
If everybody says no, if everybody says yes, what's the incentive to change?
Absolutely. So we want to help you be able to implement this. I mean, that's why we're here. So if you have questions for us, if you want our help to begin to put a team together to understand your city, that's why we're here. So feel free to contact us with 2 M's, comsolutionsmn@gmail.com. Go out to our website, read our blog, also comsolutionsmn.com. And we do want to hear from you, and we want to be able to help you. But we don't want to discourage you from getting a hold of us, so please do. And we're going to be back with another podcast real soon. Maybe got some surprises for you. We'll see how it goes. Unless you have anything else, Mr. Andrew Richter?
No, I think we covered everything.
Fantastic. My name is Jason Bradley, and we will see you back here next time. So long.